They were born into palaces of gold, draped in silk, and crowned with jewels. Yet behind the portraits of beauty and power lay a terrible secret. For centuries, Europe's most powerful families married their daughters to their cousins, their uncles, even their own blood, all in the name of keeping dynasties pure. But what did this obsession really cost? The answer is written not in the history of kings, but in the broken bodies, fragile minds, and tragic lives of the women forced to carry the curse of inbreeding. Throughout history, power has always come at a heavy price. For kings, emperors, and royal dynasties, that price was often paid not on the battlefield, but behind palace walls, within their own families. The obsession with keeping bloodlines pure and noble created one of the darkest and most tragic legacies in human history, the era of royal inbreeding. In palaces across Europe and beyond, daughters were forced to marry uncles, cousins, even brothers, all in the name of preserving a crown. And while the kings enjoyed their thrones, the women often paid the price through deformities, illnesses, infertility, and lives filled with sorrow. This is the story of history's most inbred women, and the curse that haunted them simply because they were born into royalty. The belief in pure bloodlines was not new. Ancient dynasties such as the Egyptian pharaohs had practiced incestuous marriages for centuries, convinced that their godlike status could only be preserved if their blood was never diluted by commoners. But in Europe, especially during the late medieval and early modern periods, this obsession reached shocking extremes. Among the most notorious examples were the Habsburgs, a dynasty that ruled Spain, Austria, and much of Europe for nearly 600 years. They were powerful, feared, and immensely wealthy. But beneath the crowns and golden robes, their royal women were suffering. One of the most tragic figures was Joanna of Castile, known as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Born into the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty, Joanna was a princess whose destiny was decided long before she could speak for herself. Her marriage was arranged to strengthen political alliances, but she had no choice in who she would love. Her husband, Philip the Handsome, was known for his beauty, but also for his cruelty and infidelity. Joanna's life became a torment of jealousy, paranoia, and heartbreak. Historians debate whether she truly suffered from madness or whether her so-called madness was exaggerated by men who wanted to strip her of power. But one thing is clear, her fragile mental health was worsened by her family's tangled genetics, where generations of cousin marriages had passed down instability. Joanna was just the beginning of a long line of Habsburg women whose lives would become synonymous with tragedy. The Habsburgs believed that marrying within the family was a way to preserve their dynasty's immense power. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and over time, the genetic pool shrank smaller and smaller. The result was what historians today call the Habsburg jaw, a distinct deformity where the lower jaw jutted out unnaturally, sometimes so badly that it interfered with speech and eating. This deformity appeared most famously in Charles II of Spain, but the women of the family carried the same burden both physically and emotionally. Take, for example, Margaret Teresa of Spain, the young girl immortalized in Diego Velázquez's famous painting, Las Meninas. In the painting, she looks like a glowing princess in her elaborate gown, the center of attention in a grand Spanish court. But behind that innocent face was a darker truth. Margaret was the product of multiple generations of inbreeding. Born to Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, who were uncle and niece, her family tree was not a tree at all, it was more like a twisted knot, with the same names repeating generation after generation. By the time Margaret was just 15, she was married off to her uncle, Emperor Leopold I, who was 26 at the time. The union was designed to preserve power between Austria and Spain, but it came at the cost of Margaret's health. She suffered from frequent illnesses, likely due to the weakened genetic pool, and her pregnancies were painful. She died young, at only 21 years old, after giving birth to her fourth child. None of her children survived past infancy. Margaret's short, tragic life is a chilling example of how royal women were trapped in the cycle of inbreeding, their bodies used as tools to secure dynasties, while their health and happiness were sacrificed. Another heartbreaking figure was Maria Anna of Austria, Margaret Teresa's sister, who married Ferdinand III. Her cousin, Maria Anna's life was also plagued with health issues, and her children inherited many of the same weaknesses. For the Habsburg women, marriage was not a choice, nor was motherhood, it was an obligation, a burden tied to politics, and it often ended in heartbreak. The idea of keeping bloodlines pure was seen as sacred, but in truth, it was a curse. Over time, generations of royal women were born with frail bodies, weak immune systems, and genetic disorders. Many suffered miscarriages and stillbirths. Those who survived often faced depression, isolation, and a lack of freedom. Unlike kings who could find lovers outside of marriage, queens and princesses had no such privilege. They were expected to endure whatever marriage the dynasty demanded of them. Perhaps one of the most infamous victims of royal inbreeding was Maria Antonia of Austria. another Habsburg woman, who married Maximilian II of Bavaria. Their daughter, Maria Anna of Bavaria, continued the same cycle of cousin marriages, passing down the weakened bloodline. For these women, life was often a series of pregnancies, illnesses, and early deaths. While their names are remembered in royal genealogies, their suffering is rarely told in full detail. What makes their stories even more tragic is how little control they had over their own destinies. These women were raised from childhood knowing that their bodies were not their own, they were bargaining chips in political games. Some were married as young as 12 or 13, sent away to foreign courts where they did not speak the language, forced to produce heirs as soon as possible. Many of them became isolated, lonely figures, far from home and family, locked inside gilded cages. The obsession with pure bloodlines was not limited to the Habsburgs. The Bourbon dynasty in France and the Ptolemies in Egypt also practiced similar unions. Cleopatra herself was the product of sibling marriages, a tradition among Egyptian royalty to maintain their divine image. But the Habsburgs remain the most infamous example in Europe, their faces painted into history with features that tell the story of inbreeding more clearly than any document could. What the women of these families endured was nothing short of tragic. Their health was destroyed, their children often died, and their own lives were cut short. Yet in their portraits they appear regal, composed, and untouchable, as if nothing was wrong. These paintings were propaganda, created to show strength and beauty, while hiding the weakness within the bloodline. Behind the paint, the jewels, and the crowns were fragile women bearing the weight of an entire empire's obsession with purity. It is easy to forget today that for these women, inbreeding was not a choice but a destiny. They did not choose their husbands, they did not choose their lives, and they could not escape the curse that came with their family name. Some historians argue that the madness, depression, and even cruelty found in certain royal families can be directly traced to centuries of inbreeding. In the end, the very thing these dynasties feared losing power was brought about by their own choices. By weakening their bloodlines, they made their empires fragile, just like the women who carried them. The story of history's most inbred women is not just about genetics, it's about sacrifice, control, and the price of power. They remind us that behind the grandeur of royal courts were real human beings, often suffering in silence, trapped by a system that valued crowns over lives. And this is only the beginning, because as we move deeper into their stories, we will uncover even darker truths. Women who were married to their own brothers, women who gave birth to children so deformed they were hidden from public view, and women who lived and died in complete isolation, remembered not for who they were, but only for the dynasty they served. As the Habsburg dynasty continued to dominate Europe, the women within it carried not only crowns and jewels but also the invisible weight of centuries of inbreeding. Their stories, when examined closely, reveal a heartbreaking cycle of sacrifice and suffering. To understand the depth of their tragedy, we must look at the individual women who were caught in this genetic web. Their lives shortened, their health compromised, and their happiness stolen. One of the clearest examples was Maria of Portugal, the first wife of Philip II of Spain. Maria was born into the royal house of Portugal, itself closely tied to the Spanish crown. Her marriage to Philip II was seen as a way to unite Iberian power. At first glance, she seemed destined for greatness, young, beautiful, and full of promise. But her life was short-lived. At only 17, she gave birth to a son, Don Carlos. The birth was traumatic, and Maria never recovered fully. She died at the age of 17, leaving her child motherless. Don Carlos himself became one of the most infamous symbols of inbreeding. His body was deformed, one leg shorter than the other, his shoulders uneven, and his head disproportionately large. He was violent, erratic, and mentally unstable, reportedly torturing animals and attacking servants. Some historians suggest that his madness came not just from his upbringing but from the deep genetic weaknesses passed down through generations of intermarriage. For Maria of Portugal, her death was tragic, but for her son, life itself was a torment born from the very obsession with bloodlines that was meant to secure power. Another tragic figure was Joanna of Austria, the daughter of Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. Joanna was married to her cousin, Prince John of Portugal. She was devoted, dutiful, and deeply religious, but her marriage was cut short when her husband died young. Widowed at 20, Joanna was forced to return to Spain, where she never remarried. Instead, she spent the rest of her life in religious devotion, isolated from the outside world. She was remembered as pious and virtuous, but beneath the surface, her story is one of loneliness and duty over personal desire. Joanna's life, like so many Habsburg women, was not her own. It belonged to the dynasty. As the centuries passed, the family tree of the Habsburgs grew smaller and smaller, with the same branches twisting upon themselves. The women were often at the center of these unions, sacrificed for alliances that strengthened the empire while weakening their own bodies. Perhaps the most well-known example of inbreeding's curse was Charles II of Spain, sometimes called El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. While Charles himself was a man, his story is tied directly to the women who bore him. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was both his mother and his father's niece, meaning Charles was the product of generations of close relative marriages. Mariana herself was a tragic figure, married at the age of 14 to her uncle, Philip IV, who was 33 years her senior. She endured a lonely life in court, surrounded by suspicion and rumors, and was left widowed at just 21 when Philip died. From that point on, she ruled as regent for her son Charles, who was too frail and sickly to govern. Mariana's marriage produced the most devastating evidence of the Habsburg curse. Charles II, he was physically deformed, unable to chew food properly because of his enormous jaw, and plagued by illnesses his entire life. He was infertile, and his reign marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. But what is often overlooked is how much of this tragedy began with Mariana herself, a young girl forced to marry her own uncle, robbed of a normal life, and burdened with the guilt of her son's suffering. For the women of these dynasties, motherhood was both their duty and their doom. Many suffered through repeated miscarriages and stillbirths, their bodies too fragile to withstand the strain of constant pregnancies. Queen Anne of Austria, the wife of Louis XIII of France, was one such woman. Though not as deeply inbred as the Spanish Habsburgs, she still came from closely related families. Her early pregnancies ended in miscarriage after miscarriage, and it took over 20 years before she finally gave birth to a surviving son, the future Louis XIV. Her struggles with fertility were whispered about across Europe, and she was often blamed for failing to produce heirs, as though her worth as a queen depended entirely on her womb. The pressure placed on these women was immense. They were not seen as individuals with desires, dreams, or ambitions. Instead, they were seen as vessels to continue dynasties. Their worth was measured in children, preferably sons, and their suffering was ignored or hidden behind the gilded walls of palaces. For many, the physical burden of inbreeding, combined with the emotional weight of duty, created lives of quiet misery. Consider Elizabeth of Parma, who married Philip V of Spain. Elizabeth was intelligent and politically ambitious, but her health was fragile, and she was plagued by frequent illnesses. She gave birth to numerous children, many of whom did not survive infancy. She lived in a court where whispers of curses and divine punishment circulated. But the truth was simpler. Centuries of inbreeding had made survival itself a miracle. The psychological toll on these women cannot be underestimated. Many lived isolated in foreign courts, far from home and family, surrounded by people who often viewed them with suspicion. Their marriages were rarely based on love. Instead, they were political bargains, arranged to unite kingdoms or secure treaties. A young girl might be plucked from her homeland at the age of 12 or 13, sent to a foreign country where she did not speak the language, and expected to bear children almost immediately. For some, this sudden uprooting led to depression and despair. For others, it meant a lifetime of loneliness, their only role being to produce heirs for a dynasty that did not care for their happiness. One such example was Catherine of Austria, who married King John III of Portugal. Catherine's marriage was politically advantageous, but her life was marked by sadness. Out of her 9 children, many died young, and her health deteriorated with each pregnancy. She lived a life of quiet duty, remembered not for her personality or achievements, but only as a link in the royal chain. Her story reflects the broader truth. These women's identities were erased by the demands of dynastic politics. The deeper one looks into the family trees of Europe's royalty, the clearer the pattern becomes: cousin after cousin, niece after uncle, the same names appearing over and over. For the men, this often meant power and political gain, but for the women, it meant shortened lives, broken bodies, and unfulfilled dreams. Some historians suggest that the madness of King George III of England, often remembered for losing the American colonies, may have had roots in inbreeding within European royal families. While George himself married outside his family, his ancestors had long been part of the interwoven network of European nobility, where marriages were arranged for political advantage rather than genetic health. And once again, it was often the women who bore the brunt of this system, forced into marriages that compromised not only their happiness but their health and the health of their children. When we think of royal women in history, we often picture them as elegant figures in grand portraits, draped in silks and jewels, their faces serene and composed. But behind those portraits lies the truth of their suffering. The powdered faces often hid illness. The elaborate gowns often covered frail, weakened bodies. Their smiles, painted by court artists, concealed depression, loneliness, and despair. What makes their stories especially haunting is that so few had the power to change their fates. Unlike commoners, who might at least choose whom to love or marry, these women had no such freedom. Their marriages were contracts, their children political pawns, and their bodies sacrifices for dynasties that valued crowns over human life. The more the dynasties tried to preserve their power through inbreeding, the more fragile they became. By the 17th century, the Spanish Habsburg line was collapsing under its own genetic weight. Women continued to die young, children were stillborn, and the once mighty empire was left with a King Charles II who could not produce heirs. In their obsession with purity, they had brought about their own downfall, and through it all, the women paid the price. From Maria of Portugal, dead at 17, to Mariana of Austria, forced to marry her uncle, to Margaret Theresa, who died at 21 after repeated pregnancies. Their stories echo across centuries as reminders of how power can corrupt not just politics, but life itself. As we move deeper into this history, we will see even more disturbing examples. Women who were married to their own brothers. Women whose children were born so deformed that they were hidden from public view. Women who lived in isolation, their minds broken by grief and duty. These were the hidden victims of history's obsession with pure bloodlines, remembered not for their humanity, but for the dynasties they served until their last breath. By the time the 17th century dawned, the consequences of dynastic obsession with blood purity had become impossible to hide. The once glorious courts of Europe were filled with whispers of weakness, of queens too frail to bear heirs, of children born sickly and deformed, and of entire empires trembling under the weight of their own genetic chains. In Spain, one of the most tragic women caught in this trap was Margaret Theresa of Spain, daughter of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. From the moment she was born, her destiny was decided. At just 14 years old, she was sent away from her family to marry her uncle, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor. This marriage, between niece and uncle, was another desperate attempt to keep power within the Habsburg bloodline. Margaret Theresa, remembered today from Diego Velázquez's haunting painting Las Meninas, was delicate, blonde, and angelic in appearance, but her beauty masked fragility. Her life as empress was short and painful. From the very beginning, her body was burdened by pregnancies. She gave birth 6 times in just 6 years, though only one child survived beyond infancy. Each birth weakened her further, until finally, at the age of 21, she died exhausted and broken. Margaret Theresa's life was not one of luxury or joy, but of duty, suffering, and sacrifice. Even her death did not end the obsession, for her daughter, Maria Antonia, was married off once again within the family, carrying forward the cycle of weakness. This story was repeated again and again. One can look to Maria Anna of Spain, Margaret Theresa's aunt, who was married to her own cousin, Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. Maria Anna's life mirrored that of so many Habsburg women: endless pregnancies, frequent illnesses, and an early death at the age of 30. She is often remembered in portraits as elegant and regal, yet her life was filled with pain. Behind the painted silk gowns lay a body weakened by inbreeding and broken by childbirth. The Habsburg Dynasty's obsession with blood purity had devastating consequences, and while much has been written about their kings, it was the women who carried the true burden. They were the ones forced into marriages with their uncles and cousins. They were the ones who endured miscarriage after miscarriage, and they were the ones whose health deteriorated until their bodies could no longer endure. The same fate stretched beyond Spain and Austria. Across Europe, women of noble blood were treated as pieces on a chessboard, moved across borders to secure alliances, regardless of the genetic dangers. One such woman was Henrietta of England, daughter of King Charles I, known as Minette. She was married to Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, the brother of Louis XIV of France. Though her marriage was not as closely inbred as the Habsburg unions, she entered into a court already entangled in dynastic webs. Her life was filled with intrigue and manipulation, and her early death at the age of 26 sparked rumors of poisoning. Some historians believe her fragile health may have been worsened by centuries of inbred bloodlines that ran through Europe's royal families. When we shift our gaze to Marie Antoinette, centuries later, we see another example of a woman born into the cursed cycle of dynastic politics. Though not herself the product of extreme inbreeding, her family tree was riddled with it. She was a Habsburg, the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, and like so many before her, she was sent away as a young teenager to marry a foreign king. At just 14, she was married to the future Louis XVI of France. Marie Antoinette is often remembered for her extravagance, her lavish gowns, and her supposed words, "Let them eat cake." But her private life tells a different story. She struggled for years to conceive children, her body slow to respond to the pressures of producing heirs. Gossip spread through Versailles, mocking her inability to fulfill her most important duty as queen. Eventually, she gave birth to 4 children, but only one survived into adulthood. The deaths of her children broke her heart, and when the revolution came, she faced not only political downfall but personal devastation. Though her end was the guillotine, her true suffering had begun much earlier, in the gilded prison of dynastic duty. Looking back, it becomes clear that these women were trapped in a system that saw them as expendable. They were vessels for children, pawns for treaties, and symbols of alliances. Rarely did anyone ask about their happiness, their health, or their well-being. Their bodies carried the visible scars of inbreeding, but their souls carried the invisible ones: the loneliness of being sent away from home at a young age, the grief of burying child after child, The despair of knowing their worth was measured only by the heirs they could produce. Take, for example, Isabella Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip II of Spain, and Elizabeth of married to Archduke Albert of Austria. She was one of the few Habsburg women remembered for her independent rule. When her husband died, she governed the Spanish Netherlands with grace and strength. But even her life was marked by the same curse: repeated miscarriages, childlessness, and the crushing responsibility of dynastic expectations. Her marriage was one of the rare loving ones, yet even love could not free her from the fate dictated by centuries of inbred politics. Beyond the Habsburgs, similar stories unfolded in other royal houses. The Bourbon dynasty of France, the Bourbons of Portugal, and the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria all shared the same obsession. The women within these families bore the weight of it. Princesses and queens were praised for their obedience and piety, but rarely for their individuality. Their portraits may survive, but their voices are silent, lost to history. The deeper one dives into these genealogies, the more chilling the reality becomes. Some queens were so closely related to their husbands that their family trees looked less like branches and more like circles. In some cases, siblings were considered for marriage, and uncles wed nieces without hesitation. For the men, these unions were matters of strategy. For the women, they were matters of life and death. By the 18th century, the cracks in this system were undeniable. The Habsburg jaw had become infamous, a visible mark of inbreeding. But less visible were the hidden tragedies: the young girls who died in childbirth, the queens who wasted away from constant pregnancies, the women whose mental health crumbled under isolation and duty. Each death, each stillbirth, each breakdown was not seen as a warning sign, but as an unfortunate consequence of noble destiny. The irony of this obsession with purity is that it achieved the opposite of what was intended. Instead of producing strong heirs, it produced fragile ones. Instead of ensuring the survival of dynasties, it accelerated their decline. And it was the women who bore the heaviest price. They were born into palaces but lived lives of suffering. They were queens, empresses, and princesses, but also prisoners of bloodlines. Margaret Teresa, Maria Anna, Isabella, Clara Eugenia, Marie Antoinette. These names echo across history, not just as royalty, but as symbols of what happens when power values blood over humanity. Their stories remind us that beneath the crowns and jewels were real women. Women who cried, who suffered, who longed for freedom, and who were denied it at every turn. The tragedies of these women reveal a truth that history often hides, that behind every throne stood a line of broken bodies and broken hearts. The obsession with keeping bloodlines pure created not only weak kings, but entire generations of women whose lives were sacrificed for dynastic pride. And as the centuries passed, their stories became warnings of the dangers of power unchecked by compassion. As Europe moved into the age of enlightenment and revolution, the dynasties that had thrived on inbreeding began to collapse. The French monarchy crumbled in blood during the Revolution, with Marie Antoinette losing her head on the guillotine. The Spanish Habsburg line ended with Charles II, too weak to continue his dynasty. The Austrian Habsburgs would limp on, but the scars of their genetic experiments remained. The women at the heart of these tragedies could not have known they were living in the last days of dynastic power. For them, the daily struggle was survival, surviving childbirth, surviving isolation, surviving expectations. But their lives, when we examine them now, tell us more about the cruelty of power than the glory of crowns. History remembers kings and wars, treaties and battles. But perhaps what should be remembered most are the women who endured the cost of keeping bloodlines pure. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the long shadow of dynastic inbreeding was stretching toward its final collapse. The faces of Europe's queens and princesses still bore the traces of beauty, elegance, and wealth. But behind the carefully painted portraits were stories of frailty, madness, and decline. The obsession with blood purity that had once been a badge of power was now exposed as a curse that left women broken in body and in spirit. One of the most haunting examples of this decline was Maria Josepha of Bavaria, who married Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor. Their marriage was childless, their union cold, and Maria Josepha spent her life isolated in a foreign court where she was little more than a decorative shadow. Her body had been expected to produce heirs, but her womb failed. Under the strain of dynastic expectations, she died at just 30 years old, forgotten by most, remembered only for her inability to fulfill the one duty demanded of her. The same weight fell on Charlotte of Spain, another Habsburg woman, who married her cousin, the King of Portugal. Her life was one of constant illness, hysteria, and paranoia. Historians today suggest that her fragile mental state was not merely the result of personal misfortune but of centuries of accumulated inbreeding. Charlotte's mind slowly unraveled, and the grandeur of her crown offered no protection against the darkness that consumed her. Even the most powerful monarchies could not escape. Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, mother of Marie Antoinette, had been one of the most formidable rulers of her age. She gave birth to 16 children, marrying them off across Europe in a web of alliances. But behind her strength lay the same relentless cycle. Many of her children, including daughters who became queens and duchesses, lived lives plagued by sickness, miscarriages, and weakness. Maria Theresa's legacy was immense, but it also ensured that her daughters carried forward the genetic burdens of centuries. Marie Antoinette herself became the face of dynastic tragedy. Though not as severely inbred as her ancestors, she inherited enough of the fragile Habsburg bloodline to experience many of the same struggles. Her difficulties conceiving, the loss of her children, the endless scrutiny of her body, all were echoes of the same curse that had haunted women before her. When the revolution came, she became a scapegoat, her foreign blood and Habsburg name turning her into a hated symbol of everything wrong with monarchy. On the scaffold, as the guillotine blade hovered above her, she was not just Marie Antoinette, the queen, but also the culmination of centuries of dynastic obsession, the final sacrifice in a long line of women destroyed by the demand for pure blood. Across the Channel, the British royal family too bore its own scars. Though less extreme than the Habsburgs, they too practiced consanguineous marriages, and by the time of Queen Victoria, the genetic consequences had become infamous. Victoria herself, though not inbred, carried the hemophilia gene that spread through her descendants like a curse. Her daughters passed it into the royal houses of Spain, Germany, and Russia. Hemophilia, a disease that caused uncontrolled bleeding, was sometimes called the royal disease. Once again, it was women who bore the burden, blamed for transmitting a condition that was the direct result of dynastic breeding practices. Princesses like Alexandra of Hesse, who married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, carried hemophilia into the Romanov dynasty. Her son, the Tsarevich Alexei, was afflicted with the disease, his fragile body a constant reminder of his mother's guilt. Alexandra lived in terror for her child's life, desperate for cures. And this desperation led her into the arms of the mystic Rasputin. History remembers Rasputin as a sinister figure whose influence contributed to the downfall of the Romanovs. But behind that story lies the suffering of a mother who carried the genetic curse of her dynasty. Here again we see the same pattern. Women defined by their reproductive power, women blamed for the failures of bloodlines, women sacrificed to the vanity of royal houses. Whether in Vienna, Madrid, Versailles, or St. Petersburg, the story was the same. Queens and princesses were forced into unions that damaged their health, burdened with pregnancies that broke their bodies, and held responsible for the survival of entire dynasties. When they succeeded, their reward was duty without freedom. When they failed, their punishment was scorn, exile, or death. The tragic irony is that many of these women were intelligent, capable, and strong in ways history has only begun to acknowledge. Some, like Isabella, Clara, Eugenia, showed political skill and leadership. Others, like Maria Theresa, ruled empires with determination. Yet no matter their talents, their ultimate worth was always measured in their ability to produce heirs. Even the greatest queens were still bound to the fate of their wombs. By the 19th century, science was beginning to uncover the dangers of inbreeding. Though the royal courts clung stubbornly to their traditions, the cost continued to fall on the women. Princesses were sent across Europe as bargaining chips. Their marriages decided before they were old enough to understand. Their bodies expected to repair centuries of genetic damage that no single womb could fix. The portraits of these women tell part of the story. Look closely, and you see the distinctive Habsburg jaw, the downturned mouths, the pale faces framed by heavy wigs and jewels. These were not merely fashion choices, but masks that covered weakness. Behind the painted silks and pearls were fragile bodies, many racked by disease, many already dying when the portraits were made. The more one studies them, the more haunting they become. As the 20th century approached, the world around royalty was changing. Revolutions, wars, and the rise of democracy were stripping monarchs of their power. Yet the curse of inbreeding lingered in their bloodlines, visible in the illnesses, weaknesses, and scandals that plagued royal families. Women were still at the center of it, their bodies carrying forward the legacy of centuries of dynastic obsession. Even today, when modern royals marry freely and genetic science warns against consanguinity, the ghosts of those past women remain. Their lives, their suffering, and their silence remind us of what happens when power is valued above humanity. They remind us that crowns and thrones are built not just on battlefields but on the bodies of women forced to pay the price for dynastic ambition. The tragic life stories of these women, Margaret, Teresa, Maria, Anna, Isabella, Clara, Eugenia, Marie Antoinette, Charlotte of Spain, Alexandra of Russia, and countless others, show us the real cost of keeping bloodlines pure. It was not the kings who paid most dearly, but the queens and princesses. The women whose bodies were treated as vessels, whose choices were denied, whose health was sacrificed, and whose voices were silenced. Their tragedy is not just history's curiosity, it is a warning. It tells us what happens when power ignores humanity, when women are seen only as tools of inheritance, when obsession blinds societies to compassion. These women lived and died in golden cages, surrounded by luxury yet deprived of freedom. remembered in portraits yet forgotten as people. And so, the curse of inbred dynasties is not only about deformities or diseases, but about lives lost too. Duty, about love denied, about women crushed under crowns too heavy for any one person to bear. It is about the price of power, and the hidden victims who carried it. History has often tried to romanticize these queens and princesses, painting them as tragic beauties or devoted mothers. But the truth is harsher, darker, and more human. They were women who cried, who begged, who prayed, who endured. Their suffering shaped the destiny of nations, yet their names too often fade into footnotes. To remember them fully is to see not just queens but women whose greatest tragedy was to be born into a world where their bloodline mattered more than their lives. The story of history's most inbred women ends not with their downfall, but with their legacy. The collapse of the Spanish Habsburgs, the fall of the French monarchy, the assassination of the Roman offsol remind us that no dynasty can survive when it sacrifices humanity for power. And though the women themselves could not escape their fate, their suffering stands today as testimony, as silent voices from the past calling us to remember. Their curse was to keep bloodlines pure. Their tragedy was to lose themselves in the process.